Welcome to Friday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us again today and at the end of this week, and we're going to get right back into our series entitled No Doubts. We're finding out what the roots of doubt and unbelief is in our life, how doubts come into our life, and of course, based on that, how to eliminate and eradicate those doubts in our heart. Now, we've been in Mark chapter 9, so I want to go back over there again. First of all, we pointed out the Mount of Transfiguration. That story, we talked about how that was a transitional story from the old covenant of law to the new covenant of grace in Christ Jesus. We could say it this way: it was transitioning from self-righteousness to the righteousness of God. Self-righteousness has always got a backside to it, and that is self-condemnation. It's always going to produce condemnation, guilt, and shame in our life, because self-righteousness, our own self-works, are never going to be able to earn or achieve the righteousness that God gives us free of charge by His grace in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, the righteousness of God, the revelation of God's righteousness that comes in the gospel message, as we have seen, causes us to go from faith to faith. That's the faith that the just, all of us as believers, are supposed to be living by. So we're seeing there, first part on the Mount of Transfiguration, transition from the old, the self-righteousness that was limited, that wasn't enough, that produced unbelief and doubts, self-condemnation, guilt, and shame, over into the new covenant of God's grace that results in the righteousness of God being applied and imparted to all of us. That results in us going from faith to faith. A whole different ballgame. And the new covenant is all about faith. It's all about believing in Jesus, believing in the finished work of Jesus, believing in the grace of God in Christ that is immeasurable, unlimited, and surpassing, believing in this free gift of righteousness, which David said in Psalm 71 is unlimited, salvation which is unlimited, that's provided for us by God Himself. And see, that produces a faith for the new covenant believer that you can never get to by the works of the law, by your own self-works and your own self-righteousness. So that's what we see there in the first part of Mark chapter 9. But then we looked at the story yesterday when Jesus came off the Mount of Transfiguration. Then there's a scenario of this story of this father who had brought to Jesus' disciples his son who was tormented and oppressed by a demonic spirit. It was a mute spirit, but is also a self-destructive spirit. And this demonic spirit, he didn't want to go, and he put on a song and dance, an outward show, a dog and pony show that moved the disciples into unbelief, and that prevented them from casting that spirit out. They could not cast that spirit out of that boy because they were moved by what they saw externally, this dog and pony show that this demonic spirit put on. And Jesus came down, and they brought this boy to Jesus, and that spirit did the same thing with Jesus. He put on the same song and dance, dog and pony show, threw him down on the ground, started wallowing around, foaming at the mouth, putting on all this kind of show. But Jesus was not moved by that. He was not moved by what he saw. He was operating in faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, we walk by faith and not by sight. Jesus was not moved by this at all. He was not moved by the unbelief and the faithlessness of that crowd, or that father of that child, or his disciples. He was not moved because they couldn't cast it out, a past experience. Jesus was not moved by any of that stuff. But the Father said this to Jesus. He said, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And then verse 23, Jesus turned right around, put that ball back into his court, and said this. He said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. That is the new covenant right there. That is indicative of the new covenant, not doing. See, the Father said, if you can do anything. Jesus turned around and said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. Now, he gave this father a blank check, and all of us a blank check, that if we can believe, All things are possible. What does all things include? Everything. All things are possible to him that believes. In other words, there's nothing impossible for us who believe. Why? Because we're believing in the finished work of Jesus. We're believing in the shed blood. We're believing in the unlimited, immeasurable, surpassing greatness of God's free grace in his kindness and goodness of heart toward us in Christ. We're believing, like David said in Psalm 71, that this righteousness, God's righteousness that he's given to us in the new covenant, and this salvation is unlimited. That means all things possible right there. All things are possible to him who believes. Father turned around and said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And as I pointed out yesterday, he said, Lord, I believe in my heart, help my unbelief, the doubts and the unbelief that's in my head. And you can have doubts and unbelief in your head that suppress, nullify, negate the effect of faith that's in your heart. That can happen. It can just negate and cause your faith to just be void and null. And that's the problem. It's not the fact that we don't have enough faith. It's the problem is being nullified and suppressed by unbelief and doubts. And that's what he said. But you know, Jesus had something to work with. So he went on and helped this man right here, even in his unbelief, and delivered his boy from that demonic spirit that day. Now, there's another part to this story I want to pick up in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17. Matthew the 17th chapter, because, you know, we see what Jesus did here. We see what happened, how Jesus cast that spirit out and delivered the boy. But then you have the disciples who had failed. They did not succeed that day. And so after all the crowd dispersed, everybody kind of went away. It says in verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why couldn't we cast it out? That's a good question, isn't it? I'm glad they asked that question. You know, if they had never done this before, they probably wouldn't have asked this question. I think they were surprised that day when it didn't work. And why didn't it work? Did Jesus just not give them enough authority, enough power, enough ability, you know, to cast that spirit out? No. It's because Jesus said it in verse number 20. You know, Jesus didn't beat around the bush, thank God. You know, he didn't try to, you know, just pat him on the head and say, well, you did the best you could, but leave these things to professionals only, you know. No, Jesus said because of your unbelief. Notice he said because of your unbelief. You know, the faith that we operate in comes from God. But doubts and unbelief do not come from God. They come from the outside in, and they come from men. So he said because of your unbelief. That's why it didn't work. That's why it did not work. It didn't work because they didn't have it. They didn't have the authority. It's because of their unbelief. See, that was the problem with the father of the boy. He said, I believe, help my unbelief. And that unbelief suppressed faith and kept it from working and getting an answer from God that day. But I want you to see that they had the same problem. They were moved by the crowd. They were moved by the faithlessness in the crowd. They were moved by the scribes who were pointing their bony fingers and saying, who do you think you are? You know, we're the professionals. Well, they didn't do it. They couldn't keep it. They were under the law, but they couldn't produce these results. You're not going to get these God kind of results without the God kind of faith. And you know what? When you have man-made unbelief and doubts, you're going to have problems in dealing with the God kind of faith. It'll suppress it and nullify it. And that was what was going on. He said, because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you. Notice he said, assuredly I say to you. Now, why does Jesus say, assuredly I say to you? Many times today we'll say, to be honest with you. Well, does that mean we're not always honest until we say that? No, what he means by this is I'm about to say something to you that if you're not paying attention, you may think I'm talking code language here. You may think that this is not reality. This is not reasonable truth. He said, assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you would say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Notice, in essence, Jesus made the same statement there at the end that he said to that father of that boy. He said to the father of the boy, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. He said here, if you had faith as a mustard seed, you would say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. It will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. All things are possible to him that believes. Nothing will be impossible for him who uses the faith of God in this way. And you know, Jesus said this about mustard seed, and we've always kind of looked at that, and we've kind of approached it from the fact that the mustard seed is so small, so all you basically need is faith as the size of a mustard seed. I don't know if you've ever seen a mustard seed, but you can get one caught underneath your fingernail. It's so small. It's a really small seed, and I believe he is referring to that to some degree. That's not the only thing, but I believe he is referring to the size of the mustard seed. They all were familiar with that. He said if you just had faith as the size of a mustard seed, you don't need more faith. All you need is just a size of a mustard seed, and you can release it through words of faith, and you can cause and command a mountain to be removed and cast into the sea, and it will obey you, and nothing will be impossible for them who has this kind of faith right here. But I believe he's not just talking about the size of the mustard seed. I believe he's also talking and referring to the fact it is a mustard seed. He said specifically a mustard seed. Now, in some of my research on this, I found out that a mustard plant is one of the only plants in all the world that you can't crossbreed with something else. In other words, you can't corrupt a mustard plant and engraft something else in it. And I believe that is exactly what he's referring to here. He's not only talking about the size, but he's talking about the type of seed. A mustard seed plant. He's saying if you had faith that cannot be corrupted by unbelief and doubts, then you can say to the mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, and it will obey you, and nothing will be impossible for you. See, again, the problem is not whether we have the faith of God or have enough faith or have big enough faith. The problem is we have faith that's been corrupted by other things. We have faith in here, and we have doubts and unbelief up here, and that's corrupting the faith of God and keeping it from working and doing what it's supposed to do in our life. And see, that really ties right in to what he said that we read last week in Mark chapter 11. Mark 11. Let's go back over there real quick. I got just enough time to read this because these two are tying directly in here. Mark chapter 11 verse 22 again, Jesus said, have faith in God. That is non-corrupted faith, not faith in God and faith in yourself. Because faith in yourself is always going to result in doubt and unbelief. It's going to corrupt the faith of God in us. So he said, have faith in God. And then he said, whosoever shall say unto the mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he says shall be done, he will have whatever he says. He said, in essence, the faith of God will work for whosoever, and whosoever will have whatsoever they say when they do not doubt in their heart, when their faith is pure and not corrupted by doubts and unbelief. And we already pointed out that that word doubt there is diakrino, which means self-condemnation. Self-condemnation will always produce doubts and unbelief. That's what was going on with that generation that was under the law. That was what was going on with these disciples. And you know what? That nullified, corrupted the faith of God in them, and it kept it from working in that situation. You know, and that's something that can be corrected. You can get rid of doubts and unbelief by getting rid of the self-righteousness and the resulting self-condemnation in our life. And then Jesus goes on to say, therefore I say to you, whoever says, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them. That faith of God, when it's not corrupted with self-condemnation, will work when you say it in authority, when you speak to mountains and problems in your life, things that you don't want in your life, and it also works in prayer when you're receiving something you do want in your life. That faith will work when it's not corrupted and is pure, in its purest form from God. Well, that's all the time I've got for today and for this week. Join us again next week as we continue this series entitled No Doubts. If you'd like additional resources and materials, go to tonycowan.org. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.